Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode here on the channel. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. We are back again with another author interview. My guest today was born and raised in Puerto Rico and earned his civil engineering degree from the University of Puerto Rico, Mayaguez Campus. And despite his degree in STEM, he's always had an affinity for fantasy and sci-fi. His father was a huge fan of Lord of the Rings movies growing up and would play them pretty often. And during his time at the university, he joined the Coast Guard through their college student pre-commission initiative. And since then, he is now earned a commission as an officer in winter of 2016 and has been stationed in Chesapeake, Virginia. And while he's not working as a Coast Guard, he also had the time to write his books. Not one, not two, but three fantasy books detailing the angels of heaven in this new earth where humans and angels coexist, as well as other beings as well. To tell us more about the Wings trilogy, joining us for the first time on the channel is author Francisco Colom-Brana. Francisco, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No problem, no problem. So, before we dive into your three books, what more can you tell our listeners about your background in general?
You hit the major takeaways. I studied civil engineering. During that time is when I joined the Coast Guard, and right after I graduated, I earned my commissioning, and I was stationed in Chesapeake, Virginia. I was there for 4.5 years doing counterterrorism and some crazy high-speed jobs.
Right.
And then from there, I've moved over to New York, where I work as my formal title is the Deputy Chief of Enforcement here, and I sort of manage all the waterside security events, like big ones that you could think of. Like if we have the president coming over to visit New York, we provide him waterside security
Nice.
on the East River, Hudson River. But yeah, as you said, when I was in Chesapeake, I somehow managed the time during COVID to write three books, and it's been a passion to me. Even though I'm doing all this stuff in the military, I still have room in my heart for things fantasy, and whether it's like books, games, and movies. I just have an affinity for it, and always have since I was very young.
Nice. So let's actually talk about the Wings trilogy. So, in a brief overview, because it's all three books, what is the overarching story that connects the three? Prisoners in the Sky, The Council of Three, and the third and final book, The Last Angel.
Yeah, so you kind of mentioned it briefly in your initial description. These books don't take place on Earth. It's a setting I created in a world called Gaia. And even though it draws from a lot of biblical mythology, Greek mythology, and stuff like that, it is a whole original fantasy story that takes place in its own unique setting. And when I wrote it, I kind of wanted to blend a lot of these mythological elements in a world that was not only medieval, but also steampunk, where humans are kind of, very keen and technical and resourceful. So where they lack in magic, we make up for in other stuff. So we have all these elements of magic and stuff. And there's this whole story with the world. It's not specifically its creation, but what happened when God arrived to this world, and then humans, how they interacted later on with the angels, and how that led to this angel civil war, which then led the way to the angels essentially leaving Gaia and kind of going into these remote places where there aren't humans, and they call it the lands unknown or paradise.
Right.
And essentially the world, it's left to its own devices with the angels being one, sorry, the humans being one large sect here, ruled by an archangel. And then there's the other large sect, which is the pixies, which were once humans. But as you read on, you kind of learn about their backstory of how they became pixies.
Hmm.
And there's also like the werewolves or the wolves of
Right.
Nora that the stories kind of go into later, and of course all these other elements historically within Gaia with the monsters. But that confusing backstory aside, the story does follow centrally this figure called Athid, who finds out that he's a special human because he's half human, half angel, and
Mm.
he's trying to serve, like, after kind of being this humble little kid who's orphaned, a street rat, just
Right.
living outside of the main city walls of Haven. He finds out that he's this special being. He's got this angel bloodline within him, and the archangel ruler at the time, he wants these half angels, half humans for a purpose, which isn't really known to them at the time. So
Hmm.
he's trying to find them all and bring them together to go on this quest, which is essentially to rescue his brother in a flying fortress,
Right.
because they are the key to releasing him. So the story follows Athid and how he gets picked up for this adventure, and the trials and tribulations he goes through, and how he leaves his hometown, his city of Haven, and kind of goes out into the world and starts experiencing everything that comes with it: war, magic, friendship, loss,
Hmm.
just to finish this king's wish of going to this flying fortress. And that's essentially the main plot of the first book. But from there, the story continues on with what happens after Athid reaches the prisoner in the sky, with the monsters returning to Gaia, and the humans and pixies, and this seemingly like violent war that just started. What's Athid's role in this? Is he more
Hmm.
important, and in helping this new archangel that he released from the flying fortress? Where does it all lead? Where is it going to culminate? So the story follows him and his progression through the lands of Gaia, as there's this war unfolding, monsters are returning, and you're just learning more about the history of the world itself.
Right. And honestly, I read like a little bit from each three books, and I love how in each three you always have this introduction of like the volume of Gaia, where it really does set up like the world building. I really appreciate that because it makes it so unique in my opinion. Because very rarely in like books that I've read that in the beginning it's usually like the prologue of like that sets up the world, but never have I read a story where it's like taken from the volume of Gaia, issue 1, issue 2, or 7. I found that very unique. So when writing all three books, did you initially have a promise you want to make to your readers, a need or desire you want to fulfill in them when you want them to read all three books for the Wings trilogy?
Yeah, like the way I see it, I drew a lot of influence from these games called Dark Souls. They're from soft games that you could just play them casually and not realize there's this plethora of lore and backstory behind everything, and it's really amazing and beautiful. And the other source of inspiration I had was also from the Dune books. If you've read them, at the beginning of every chapter, there's like a quote, and what you're actually reading in the main story of Dune happened way in the past, even though you're reading it like in the present. But it's stuff that happened in
Okay.
the past, and they have these like little excerpts before each chapter, which I really enjoy, because it's like stuff that's they're talking from the future, and then you're essentially reading, the events going on that happened in the past. So when I kind of took that, I didn't want to do that for every chapter, but I wanted, if you weren't a casual reader, if you're someone who enjoys getting into the nitty gritty, into the histories and all the little details, I wanted to give those readers something so they can sort of jump into my world and see how lived in it is, and hopefully it has like a rich history that they can enjoy and kind of pick apart. And then if they're really keen, they can sort of take some of that stuff and maybe piece some clues together as to what might happen later on in the present following Athid. Um,
Right.
Otherwise, if you're more of a casual reader and you're just like reading along, and you're like, all right, these are just cool little details for you. And then as you read the story, I didn't try to write the story so that it's complicated. I tried to write it so it's in a sense for a broad audience. I'd rather try to tell a good story than be good at telling a story.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, it also hopefully accommodates an audience that could just, if they casually like to read fantasy books, they can just pick this up. They don't have to take down notes and do, integrate like
Charts and
plotting
graphs.
charts and stuff. Yeah, exactly. With the red string and all that, they could just casually read along and be like surprised, and be, oh, cool. This unfolded and that unfolded, and hopefully just enjoy the adventure for what it is.
Nice. So when you finished writing the initial draft of all three books, what was the feedback like from friends and family? And has that same feedback transferred over when you officially published all three?
It's an interesting question. So initially, I remember giving it to one friend and also my little brother, and I'm like, does
Mm-hmm.
this outline even make sense? Is it even cohesive? I was actually looking at the outline before this interview just to kind of refresh my mind what my thought process was back then. And even back then, I could tell I was like struggling putting together all the times, like how long does it take this character getting from point A to point B? How long should it be, between the first book and the second book? And even their names are not exactly what I had outlined back then. But yeah, I gave it to my little brother, and he was like, okay, like this sounds kind of cool, right? And I gave it to my other friend, and she's like, yeah, like this seems like you got like quite a story there. But I knew it really wasn't enough, and it wasn't until I had like initial first drafts of each of the books,
Right.
and they were, I'd say like maybe 60 to 70% products of what each book is now. Back then, them being the first books I've ever written, I was like, oh, this is great. This is excellent. I still had a lot of feedback from actual editors that I paid because they're paid to be, a little bit more harsh in critiquing you.
Right. Definitely.
But from at least from those initial drafts, when I gave them to my little brother, he was like, "Oh, this is awesome. This is really cool. Like, I love reading it. There's always action. There seems to be stuff going on. I love the character progressions and the growth and where the story is going." So that really motivated me. And even he told me it's like, maybe there's some gaps here and there.
Mm-hmm.
And then, me wanted to turn in a good product. I was like, yeah, I should pay someone who will actually be harsh to me. And when I gave it to her, she was like, oh, this is also great. A lot of positive stuff on the first drafts. And then she's like, you need to do this and fill in this here because I have questions about this and that and what happened to
Right.
this character. And I was like, you're absolutely right. And it hurts a little bit, but at the same time, deep down that you should have those things. So I went back
Definitely.
in and I would call those my skeletons, and then from there I kind of like finished the full model, I guess.
Awesome. So would you say, looking back at everything with now seeing all three of your books and seeing the reviews you've gotten on Amazon, that your promise that you initially started with all three has been like validated, that you honored the promise you were making to the readers who read the Wings trilogy?
Yes. Yeah, and I certainly hope the audience feels the same way. But I've gotten enough feedback at this point that it seems like I would manage to get a successor.
Awesome. Well, that's always great. And honestly, when I was reading all three, I was like, the world building it's so great. It's a breath of fresh air, and it almost kind of reminded me of that other video game, Darksiders, where it was the horsemen of war, death, that kind of world building where angels and humans existing, but the world is kind of not really Earth. I mean, yes, it is Earth, but it's kind of a different Earth. And this one, in this world, it's Gaia. And I just love all the interconnecting lore that ties to it. So I guess my next question is, how do you manage to keep all the information cohesive in the sense that I'm sure you agree when initially starting out and trying to connect all these different plot elements can go into their own tangents to create their own spin-offs and other projects. How did you make sure that you had a clear ending and a definitive beginning for this very, very lore-rich and probably one of my new favorite fantasies of 2024?
Well, initially it's kind of hard because I had the concepts for the first book, The Prisoner in the Sky,
Right.
and that was an idea that I had that continually evolved, but I had a big problem with it, and it's
Mm-hmm.
didn't have an ending. It had a cliffhanger.
Oh, okay.
Um, yeah, and I don't know if you want this to be a spoiler, a free chat or not, but
Go right ahead.
okay, well, everyone's been warned. But at the end of the first book, essentially, the main character, he makes it to the prisoner in the sky, and then he's with the prisoner in one cell, and all of his friends are in a separate part of the castle. And when he releases the prisoner, the magic holding everything together falls apart, and the castle essentially splits in half. One group ends up somewhere, and our main character and the angel end up somewhere else, and you don't know what happened. And I was like, that's such an awesome idea. At least, me personally, like I love that idea. But for a while after that, I was like, where do I go from there? Um,
Right.
and so you just asked me about the ending and everything. I knew that I didn't want to start writing these unless I knew where this would go. And it slowly came to me like over time, over the course of the next year or so. Because I just sort of like shelved this idea where I was like, oh, this is really cool, but I'm just gonna shelve it for now because I don't know where this is gonna end, and I'm not gonna
Right.
begin or bother writing it. And that actually ties back to like what you were asking about. How does everything tie together?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when I think of something like that, where the ending and where does it go, I also think about the little things too of a character and their backstory, where they're from, that location. Why does that location exist? Why is it there? I need to have the answer to the why before I start implementing everything. And it's not, it sounds small, but it's actually big. Just having the location of a city and its architecture, if it's like stone or wood or whatever the case is, and if the buildings are pointed versus domed, I like to have a reason why. And then have like my own little history behind each thing that ties to the world, because that way, it feels real. It feels like an
Right.
actual location. So yeah, over time, the idea sort of came to me of where I wanted Athet to go from there. I knew that I wanted there to be a period of time that happens between the first book and the second book. And this was one of those things, going back to my outlines, where I saw initially I'd written, I wanted 2 years to pass between the first book and second book.
All right.
And then I went back and I was like, no, that's too long. And it doesn't make sense. The why there just in my head sounded good, but it made more sense to just make it 3 months and kind of explain how things in the world are developing, because it also ties into the narrative of the second book, because it picks up 3 months after the castle splits, and
Right.
that's really what happened to Athet. But people come back to this major pixie city to try to help them out as the humans are setting up to continue essentially their war into the pixie lands themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that 2 years after that, I would have to fill in a huge gap of time, and it wouldn't make sense to where I wanted Athet to be as an integral member and witness to these events of the war itself as well. So 2 years, I
Nice.
scratched that. Came back after a lot of thought, and I was like, okay, 3 months makes a lot of sense. Like, I've been through several trainings in the military, and he's training and getting a bunch of stuff done in the mountains, and 3 months seems like a perfect amount of time that I can go back
Right.
to that.
Right.
And I knew there too, it wasn't just the second book, it was what happens after the second book, as now we have the actual larger looming threat of the monsters coming back from underground and wanting to retake the planet, because they were the original occupants of the planet even before the angels and God. So this is the actual major threat, and I knew that by the third book, that was going to be the focus. And I knew in my head at least, where Athid was going to go and how the story was going to end. And I was like, all right, perfect. The same with like the cities and locations and having all the whys tied to that. That's when I knew. I was like, okay, I have to write this. I think it's going to be a great story. Why not give it a shot?
Awesome. And that kind of actually leads into the next question. So, I'm sure for listeners who have listened to this podcast for a long time, being an indie author is not easy. We have to put a lot of time, hard work, dedication, and it is a very lonely process. And to get one book out is a huge accomplishment. To get a whole trilogy out all together within a few years of each other is an amazing achievement, but it's also kind of a very daunting task because we have to make sure A, they're connected, B, it actually flows right. It's the same kind of language in the first book. And also C, we pick up on what the readers like in the last two books to make sure we get a definitive conclusion. And that's kind of a lot of pressure for us authors to do. I mean, that's everything plus, not to mention the world around us. So for you, Francisco, how would you say you balance everything from your work and writing? What is your why in essence? What motivates you to still write, even when some would argue it may be easy to just step back and not write for a while?
Yeah, I guess I think back. So one of my favorite authors is Stephen King because I
Mhm.
love how he writes, and I've read his memoirs and a few other things of on writing essentially. And he said something that struck with me at least, where if you have this idea and you continue having this idea, and let's say a month passes, 2 months, or maybe even a year, and you still have these ideas in your head, you should write them down because if clearly it means a lot to you, and the fact that it stuck around without you having to put it down on paper or anything, like you should give it some, I guess, some sort of credit. So that resonated with me, and like circling back to like how I managed it. I was pretty bad about it. Truth be told, it is a lot of work, and I
Mhm.
didn't really have a life. what what helped me was timing. Really,
All
I'm
right.
not a really good writer, and in my job, they've always told me I should work on that. So, in addition to having these ideas in my head and getting feedback at work, like, "Hey, you should work on writing," um, COVID happened. We
Right.
were during the COVID-19 pandemic. They started quarantining everyone. You were stuck at home, and I remember this was in 2020, like early 2020.
Right.
Like I'd already come back and I had a bunch of these ideas in my head, but that was really the spark for me because after a week of staying at home, like I couldn't go do my job, which I actually really did enjoy my job at the time, but um, because no one knew what to do with this virus and we were stuck at home. Well, after a week, I was sort of already going stir crazy and losing my mind. And like I mentioned, I had these ideas. I had the criticism of like trying to improve my writing. I was like, well, why don't I give this a shot? And after that first week, I just started writing down the outlines. And that's when I was like, oh, this is really cool. And I thought I was patting myself because together the outlines turned out to be like 28 pages for all three books. And I'm like, wow, like I wrote a lot. And it took me a whole week to write this, a whole week or 2 weeks.
Dang.
And I thought maybe I would leave it there because, like, writing a book, who does that? That's daunting. You have to be crazy or someone who has a degree in this. Um, but I was like, what the heck? Like, we don't know when we're going to get out of quarantine. And it seems to be dragging on longer than we anticipated. So, and also just a little context. I was living in Virginia at this time, and it was just me and my girlfriend at the time living together. So we were both kind of going a little stir crazy, and then I was like,
Right.
okay, I'm just gonna start writing, and if I could write a page a day, back then to me that was huge. That was monumental. Again, I was like giving myself a pat on the back, like, oh, I wrote a whole page today. But then I started really loving the process, the creation behind it, and letting my imagination flow, my creativity flow. And I was like, no, I need to keep doing this. Like, I take full advantage. I don't know when I'll be going back to work, so
Right.
I just started working on it. I didn't care how bad it looked at first, because believe me, um, even now, like, you read this, but I've read each of these books more than you could possibly imagine, and retouched them, and the editing and stuff that went into them. So I'm sorry if you think that there's a lot of like errors, or I could have written this or that, but believe me, this was probably the best I could do at the time. I know now if I wrote them, there's a lot of stuff that I could, maybe clean up.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah, so I just started writing, and at the end of the process, which I think I honestly can't remember very well. I feel it was like anywhere between like 3 to 6 months, because at that point I was writing every day. I was at the end of it, I was writing about 15, like 10 to 15 pages a day, and I'm like, wow, like I really progressed from where I was at first. And then like to me it was a race, because after like those 3 or 6 months of quarantine, there was just a lot of pressure to get back to work, for people to start figuring out ways to get back to work, especially my job in the military and what I was doing in Virginia.
Right.
So then at that point, like I started going back to work, and I think I'd maybe just finished, or probably somewhere around the second book draft.
Mm-hmm.
And for the third book, I was like, okay, now I'm getting into the schedule where I'm off and on work. And I was like, I have to keep doing this when I'm off work, because I don't know when I'm going to go back full time. And if anyone is wondering, books usually take a lot longer than that. It is a huge undertaking. I
Yes.
don't have kids. I I understand that some people, especially if I try doing this now, it is a lot different. It's a lot harder, because I'm back full time. I've been taking online classes. I also want to try to have a personal life. So I'm trying to balance things a little bit better. And so I do have ideas, and I am working on a new project. So, but it is definitely something I'm just going to take my time with, and, to just be easy with it, because these books that initially I was going into it just hard headed. I wanted to get it done, and I
Right.
didn't have a life, didn't have a personal life. So I was typing away every day. But please don't feel pressure to follow that method. There's no, at least from my understanding and hope, no one's holding a gun to your head being like, you need to get this done within 3 weeks. This is just a passion project of mine that I undertook, and put these pressures on myself to have them done almost, under a year. And then from there, I use the following years to keep revising and updating and doing other stuff with the books.
Honestly, that is probably the most 100% true, probably the truest statement I've ever gotten from an indie author, which you are correct. Unlike traditionally published books, for my listeners who want to know more about this, the beautiful thing when it comes to indie authors, like the one shining light in the whole struggle we have to go through when paying for editors, marketers, cover artists, illustrators, and so forth, we have the ability to edit our books at our leisure to make the changes, and we can just submit those changes without anyone noticing, as opposed to with traditionally published books. If there's an edit in there, that's kind of a death sentence for a new author. So that's one of the shining lights for indie authors. And honestly, I 100% have to agree with you, Francisco. When I started working on my first book, which took me like 5 years to do, I started writing it around the time, as you said, probably early, I want to say like early to mid 2020, because I was still in school, and I was at school in San Francisco, and I live in Southern California. So I had to go all the way back down. And of course, all my classes were online. I was getting so crazy, like you, as you said. And so it's
Mhm.
like, I need to keep something done. I had my old book, The Gathering, and probably by the summer, I had that finished. I was like, yes, I finally done it. I didn't have anything to do. Like, I couldn't go out, so I was just stuck in the house. And then after that, I was still in the same mindset. I knocked out my second book, which was a spin-off, What If, my third book, and my fourth book. So in 2 years, I got down with like 4 books. And I was like, no one should do this, but I was still in the same mindset. And now looking back and working, it's like I could have given myself a break. I didn't
Yeah,
have to like
definitely.
go like the struggle. It's like, as you said, no one put a gun to my head saying you have to finish all 4 books. But
Yeah.
as you also said, it's a passion project. I want to get these done. And that's often like the best rewarding feeling for any author. And speaking of authors, you mentioned before that Stephen King is like probably another one of many mentors and authors that you admire and respect. Who would you also say have been your biggest role models in terms of like authors in storytelling? And what books have also been a big form of inspiration? I know you mentioned Dune as well, but what other works of fiction, what other stories would you say were integral to the creation of the Wings trilogy?
So this is going to be kind of embarrassing because I have read Lord of the Rings, right? And I'm pretty sure people are probably going to quote that a lot, especially if they're big fantasy fans. But if you read my
Right.
book, it is not written nearly as elegant as Tolkien writes his.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, one of my huge sources of inspiration, actually, now that I have my computer pulled up, pull that up for you because I do have a list of authors here. Actually, Emily Rhoda, I believe the name is. In middle school, I had picked up randomly, and this is like surprising for me back then. It was a 4 set of books called Dragons of Del Toro. And
Right.
the only reason I picked it up back then is because I thought the artwork looked really cool. And in the center of it, it had this really cool silver dragon pendant. And I was like, I could care less about the books. That dragon pendant looks awesome. And so I ended up buying the book solely on that. And I remember just playing around with that little pendant because I was like, oh, this is so cool. And then one day I was like, well, why don't I read these? And I didn't know at the time, but these were a series of books that already, I guess they were a sequel to another series. But I just jumped in and started reading them. And like, if you pick up those books now, you can easily read them in a day.
Right.
They're written for a very like young age, but back then I just loved how easy it was to pick up and read, and it essentially followed this story of this young prince and how he had to go to these. It's so simple. He just had to go to like the east, north, west, and south. Each of the 4 books with him going to these
Right.
locations with his little party. There's like 2 other people. He solves like one mystery or clue or whatever, and the end goal of each book was that he's trying to get a dragon from each of these points to help him fight an evil that's seeping in each of those 4 points in his lands, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because from those 4 points, it's like how the corruption is spreading.
Ah, okay, all right.
And I
Nice.
really loved it because just the way, again, it's nothing crazy, but it's a fun little adventure that I would find myself, completing, and then B, like rereading, which I really enjoyed. I like stories that you can pick up and reread, even though that you're going into them, like you still get that same exact excitement, even though what the end, like he's gonna solve the same mystery that you've read multiple times, and what the outcome is gonna be. But it was still exciting for me, and I
Right.
think that was one of the bigger pieces for me when I was writing a book like this. Is that in the back of my mind, I thought, how cool would it be if like another kid my age just sees these books and starts reading them, and like my books are essentially what Dragons of Del Toro were for me. Um,
Nice.
I kind of lost a little bit my train of thought on the question. Sorry, just rambled
It,
on.
it's
But
it's okay.
if like I said, you read her, she's not really super elegant with everything. It's a very like almost elementary level of reading. But books like that, to me, I would much rather enjoy, because I like reading stories for the story, not for
Mhm.
how well and great you can write. That's awesome. But if I
Right.
could get into it because of the story, well, then that's where you have me locked in.
Nice. And actually, you kind of almost answered the next question I was going to ask you, which is, would you say that you write for yourself, that this is the book that you would want to have read growing up, or do you write for a particular reader mind, like your ideal reader? And if so, what qualities do you look for in your ideal reader?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I do feel like I am writing for myself. Like I said, if someone my age back then picks up my books now, and some of the feedback I have gotten from coworkers whose children, are like 13 years old, and they pick up my books and read them and they love it. I hope that to me is like, all right, I hit the core what I wanted. Because hearing that excitement of when my coworkers tell me like day after day is like, hey, my kid really wants to know when the sequel is coming. When are you finishing this? I'm like, that's great. And it is definitely something I wrote like with myself in mind. Because it kind of going back to some of the stuff Stephen King had said, because I like the way of how he writes. He at least in his view, he feels like you don't have to get too specific into the details of description. A lot of times us as readers will pick up on that.
Right.
We kind of like autofill things. So unless there's something really specific that you want to detail, sure, go ahead. But I feel like a lot of times, like when I read his stories, he's in it for the story and where the characters are going and what's happening. And a lot of times, like when he describes a character, it's just like basic traits, and your mind sort of fills that in. So he's like, yeah, don't get too caught up on all that. And I'm like, yeah, that's like very similar to what I like reading. There's a reason, like I like how he writes. I liked how Dragons of Del Toro was written. Um, and again, it's very basic, but I figured like if I'm an audience, then clearly there's more people for it. And I want anyone, young, old, to be able to pick up my stories and appreciate them. Not trying to like undersell myself here and say like, yeah, I'm writing at a first grade level, but I do hope that because I know several adults who've picked up my stories and have reached out and have also said they've enjoyed it, and I'm glad because that to me proves my point that the story, the context really matters. Vice just trying to be like the craziest writer out there.
Nice. And would you say, looking back at the review and response you've gotten from all three books, that you've had your promise has been like validated for your audience and your readers, that what you set out to do writing all three books is like, yes, I'm glad people are picking up on the promise and the promise I made to myself. And kind of speaking on reviews, do you have a particular review in mind, either from family, coworker, reviewer, that really stands out to you?
Yes, there's two. Because I have heard a lot of nice things, but I feel like legitimate critiques or negative feedback always stick out more in your mind. Not that these were negative, I would call them more critiques.
Right.
One of them was a legitimate critique that I appreciated, and it was on Amazon. They gave me a 4 out of 5, and they said that the use of the term gang was overused in the first book. And I was rereading the first book, and I'm like, yeah, you're absolutely right. But that didn't even resonate with me when I've read it the 30 other times in the writing process. And I knew that's something that wasn't even an issue in the following books because by then my writing had matured. And I was
Right.
like, that's a good criticism. But overall, like I didn't feel like it impacted the story at all. Clearly, this was a person who probably picks up on a lot of reading, and that stood out to them. And I was glad that they actually gave me legitimate criticism. But apart from that, they also said that they really enjoyed the story and where it was going. So it was great. The other review I got that stands out to me was actually really funny. He was another coworker of mine.
All
His
right.
daughter reads a lot. Bookworm. She actually has an app. Oh, what's this called? Something. I forgot what it is. It's something reading, but like you can go into it and leave reviews on books.
Oh, okay.
Oh, let me see if I can find it real quick because I don't know if you've heard of it or not. Goodreads.
Yes, yes, I've heard of Goodreads. Yes, a lot of my friends have used Goodreads to post and leave their books on there for people to leave reviews on.
Yeah, it's a great app. And so my coworker's daughter is maybe 12 or 13 as well. She's a huge reader, but she's more of a romance reader. And I told him, I forewarned him, I was like, well, it's great that you're picking up my book for her, but um, I write this for my specific audience, and it's something I always tell people. Don't feel pressured, amongst friends and families, don't feel pressured to buy my book. Obviously, I appreciate it because you're trying to support me. But if it's not something you read, I know people are more into nonfiction. I know people are more into thrillers and romance, whatever the case is, and maybe fantasy is just not your thing. It's there's an audience for each thing. That's why people pick up different genres.
Right.
But he went ahead. He bought his daughter my books, and she was excited to read them. And he comes back to me. He's like, "Yeah, like she leaves reviews on Goodreads. You just finished your book. Go ahead and check it out." And so
Nice.
I go into Goodreads and I see her review. It's the only review for my book there. And I almost start laughing. I think she gave me a 4 out of 5 stars. But she was like, "Oh yeah, this was great, blah blah blah, but it was missing more romance." And I was like, you're absolutely right. I can't win them all.
Mm,
But that always stuck out with me, those two reviews. I do appreciate all the nice reviews because it does solidify at least what I was thinking. And
right.
at least my thoughts that if it's something that I would enjoy picking up and read, and it seems to translate to others. But yeah, those two are really funny. One was actual legit criticism. The other one was like, I need to add more romance. And I was like, all right, you're right.
I 100% agree. And as I've always said on this channel, reviews always help us authors because not only do it boost our sense of validation that we found like a audience and a potential group that people will enjoy our work, but it also helps boost our notoriety in the publishing world. Being an indie author is not easy. You put a lot of time, sweat, blood, and tears into this. Sometimes you have to go possibly into debt to get one book out, depending on like what kind of editor you want to use,
Yep.
what kind of artist you want to use, and then so forth and so forth. So now going into more of the business side of the segment, Francisco, when you finished all three books, what was sort of like your business research mindset when looking at, okay, what platform do you want to self-publish under? And what have you learned from that initial experience?
Okay. I want to start by caveating that this is a huge weakness of mine. So whatever I say, maybe take with a grain of salt, because
Nah, no worries.
I
No
know I
worries.
could do a way better job at marketing. But as soon as like I published a book, I was like, all right, great, I'm done, and kind of want to forget about it. But there was actually another author that came to mind. His name is Evan Winters. And randomly, I picked up his book, Rage of Dragons, in
Mm-hmm.
Barnes and Noble one day. And I started reading it because one of the things I liked doing when I was in Virginia was going into Barnes and Noble and picking up a completely random book I've never heard of and giving it a shot.
Same.
Yeah, I'm tired of, no offense, but I'm tired of seeing Lord of the Rings front and center, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, like the same books. Like I
Yes.
wanted I wanted to branch out. I wanted to read more. So I randomly picked up that book and I was like, this is really good. I love it. And I started after I finished it, I started looking more into it, were there sequels, this and that, and I did a little bit of research on the author, who turned out that he started off as an indie author, and that book, it just caught fire through word of mouth, and he didn't even realize it until he got like a text, I think it was one morning, and they're like, "Hey, like your book's pretty much a bestseller," and he thought like when he got that text that they were joking, but no, it caught fire, and he ended up, I believe, publishing with someone. But I was listening to some interviews and stuff about him, and he said, I was doing advertising with these entities, and he found that with like Facebook and Instagram, it was really good, not so
Mm-hmm.
much with these other ones. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to take his word as gospel. I'm not even going to invest money in other things. I'm just going to invest money on advertising in Facebook and Instagram.
Right.
So I kind of came up with a rough business page for Facebook and Instagram. And then from there, I kind of like used the the advertising mechanism. And for years, I was also using the one on Amazon.
Hmm.
You know, if you didn't know this, Amazon for our first book will promote it for 100 days, and the algorithm helps general audiences pick up on it and stuff like that. But after 100 days, it pretty much just honestly disappears. And I kind of learned this. I didn't realize that I had still been investing in the Amazon advertising for years without any return, pretty much. And I know I've talked to some other self-published authors who
Hmm.
use Amazon and it works great for them. It wasn't working great for me at all. That I was
Ah,
paying, I was
okay.
dumping money into Amazon advertising, and nothing was coming from it. Whereas with Facebook, I seem to be getting just some views and stuff, but Instagram was really where it was kicking off. So it took me a while to kind of like go back and be like, all right, I think I'm just gonna like cut ties, not cut ties, but just stop like investing in Amazon advertising and just stick to Facebook and Instagram.
Right.
And going back to your question, you asked who I published with and why. Well, I published with Amazon. It was just obviously they're really well known. A
Hmm.
lot of things. They just have a bunch of stuff that I love. Well, the free
Right.
publishing with them, the fact that you don't have to buy orders and sell them yourself. Whenever someone buys a copy online, they print it for them, and it goes, it gets shipped straight to their address. So I just loved all that stuff. And if the editors that I worked with during the writing process, they've also published, self-published, and they were telling me the pros and cons of some of the other ones. But Amazon always seemed to be just the best choice and the easiest. So I was like, okay, like I'm not even like this is always a passion project to me. And again, that's why I said take my advice with a grain of salt when it comes to marketing, because I didn't realize when I started writing these books, like it wasn't even a thought to me before I published these books about the marketing and all that.
Right.
And I was like, oh my God, this is a nightmare. I have to do this. But if you do invest in it, you do think smart, there you can actually get better returns. I'll admit. But I'm probably just not the best guy for that. I try to go in and do what I can. I really love doing it on Facebook and Instagram. Like I love talking to people and doing my advertisements and reaching out that way. But
Right.
you're not. I'm probably the worst person at that. I have a coworker who would be excellent at this question because he self-publishes like it's his second job. Like he has a full-time job, but he self-publishes like it's his actual full-time job, and he knows all about the numbers game, which advertisements work, how you should publish, all this stuff. He's been doing it for years, and I like take his advice, but I'm horrible at actually following it.
All right. I completely understand. When I started self marketing, I didn't know what to do. And talking with a bunch of my friends, like, you got to do this, you got to do this. So I'm like active on my YouTube channel promoting my book. I'm active on LinkedIn promoting my work. Instagram, I've started promoting my work is there. And it's a grind. It's a tedious
Yes.
grind. You definitely have to do it because you have to be consistent. And again, as I said before, as indie authors, that's always the biggest thing. You have to be consistent with your marketing, and sometimes it's a hit or miss, but you will get a audience that will love your work. And at the end of the day, that is what matters. It's people who love your stories. And we're just nearing the end of the interview. So the last few questions I did want to ask you on, Francisco. The first one is, who would you say have been your biggest supporters in the on this journey for you in your life? The second question is, have you ever gotten a sense of validation from other indie authors who have picked up a copy of your trilogy? And the third and final question, which is arguably probably the most important one, what is your word of wisdom to other authors who want to go into the indie world? What is your word of wisdom?
Um, so I guess to answer your first question, definitely my little brother. He helped validate a lot of my work. He grew up with a lot of similar interests like me. We played a lot of similar video games, and like I had mentioned Dark Souls earlier, but Final
Right.
Fantasy VI, which is a Super Nintendo game, was a huge source of inspiration for me. Just growing up, I absolutely love the story. To this day, I still love it. I'm a huge fan of it. And that was something that me and my little brother also enjoyed, like together growing up. And I knew that if it could get his attention, him being a fan of this material, then that would be such a huge win.
Nice.
Um, before I go on, sorry, before words of wisdom, what was that second question?
The second question is: have you ever gotten a sense of validation from other indie
Oh,
authors who have picked
authors.
up a copy of your book or books?
Yeah, so there was one. He did this cool thing, and I wish like other authors did this. He reached out to me. This was very early on when I first published. He reached out to me on Instagram, and he was like, "Hey, I think maybe I had one book at that time. It was just The Prisoner in the Sky."
Right.
And he was like, "Hey, like I saw you self-published. I self-published recently. I think it would be really cool if you read my book and I read yours, and we left each other reviews." And I was like, "Yeah, what the heck? Why not?" I read his book. It's called Pandemonium, and sorry, his name's not coming to me right now.
It's all
Um,
right.
I thought it was a fun little read, but to me, it was more like that experience of reading each other's work and then going back and writing reviews, which I thought was really cool. He left a really nice review on Amazon for me, and I did the same for him. And the only other author I could think of, because there's a few I know who've reached out to me, but I don't think they've necessarily read my books. They just like the background and stuff like that, the fantasy setting. But they reach out to a lot of authors too, so I don't blame them
Right.
for that. I know it'd be impossible to read everyone's work. But the only other one I mentioned is my coworker, who's also an indie author. I don't know if he'd want me to share his name or not, but he said that he just randomly started reading my stuff on Kindle. And he's like, "Yeah, it's really awesome." And maybe he'd pick up like a little mistake here or there, but he was like, "Don't worry about that." As indie authors, and this will be one, I guess, one little small word of wisdom. He's like, "Don't worry about like if you catch like one little misspelling here or there. It's going to happen. You're not going to be able to catch every single mistake."
Yes,
And
that is true.
if you're like me, who I've read, when I tell you I've read these books more times than you can imagine before even publishing, stuff still slips through the cracks. So he's like, yeah, like some stuff here and there. And he said, yeah, like he's like, admittedly, he really liked the narrative structure of mine and all that. So he validated me, which I thought was really nice. He's more of a writer that just not maybe not necessarily outlines things. He just free flows. He publishes a book, and whether it's good or not, he's like, you know what, I got to move on to the next one. So hearing him say that he liked my stories was really nice. And then this is the biggest thing. I guess I'll move into the words of wisdom because I have had a lot of people reach out to me, close friends, family, and just people in general, asking me like how'd I do it, that they've always wanted to write, but they just never did. And it kind of blew my mind the number of people that told me that they wanted to write and see me publish motivated them, and they kept asking me like what's the secret. And I was like, I always thought you're asking the absolute worst guy for this. Again, in my mind, I always thought that to write, you needed to have the background in it and all this stuff. I was like, when I tell you, I was not a good writer or anything. I just went into this because I have an overactive imagination, and I actually got enough criticism that says I should work on writing. Um, I always tell them, just write, just write it, however long it takes. Don't worry about anything else. Like the end product will be there. Because going back to what I mentioned earlier, I know some people, they have kids, they have crazy hours when it comes to their job. But at the end of the day, like what matters is just getting it done.
Right.
And I've heard somewhere, I forgot who it was, because I've seen just a few things on writing on YouTube and stuff like that where I forgot what the statistic was. It was something crazy, but the majority of people can't even finish a book if they start it. That's if
Right.
they start it, and it's people who call themselves writers too, or do have the background in this. So that's why that's my biggest piece is just write it. I don't know what you need if it's like motivation or something, but if all you do, it's something like me, where you just write a page a day. Again, no one's holding a gun to your head, hopefully. Like, you could just take your time with it. Maybe after a few months, you'd be shocked. You'll find an actual book in your hands, and then from there you could do whatever you want because you've written it. You can look into marketing like some better authors do, or you can be like me and kind of be lazy about it. But when you actually have your book in your hands, there's no greater feeling.
And that's probably the honest, truest thing. At the end of the day, just write. It can be one page, it could be a paragraph. As long as you write and as long as you get something down, the story is going to come to you in the end. One of the things I always like to say is write drunk, edit sober. Don't try to be technical. Just get your
Yes.
thoughts on a page and then edit with a clear mind. Because at
Yes.
the end of the day, you can't edit a blank page. You have to have something on there. Even if it's not your story, even if it's just like something you just put down just to get the writing started, that's probably at the end of the day the simplest and most effective thing to do. Just write. No
Yep.
matter how long it takes, no matter how long the page is or how short it is, just write and the story will come to you at the end.
Yep. Absolutely.
And listeners, this will conclude another wonderful author interview here on the channel. I want to thank our guest Francisco for joining us. Francisco, thank you so much for being on the channel.
Thank
Before
you.
we officially end, where can people find and engage with you? They want to know more about the Wings trilogy and just to say hi and just connect.
Yeah, please reach out to me on Amazon, Francisco. I think it's, let me, this is how bad I am about this. But if you look up FR Colom-Brana altogether, that's my Instagram. People will reach out to me randomly and message me, and I try to answer as many as I can. Apologies if I don't, but yeah, I try to look into as many comments and messages, and I honestly appreciate it if you guys do want to reach out to me and want to ask questions or talk or whatever.
Awesome. And I'll be linking all those down below in the description of this video, the links to all three of his books. And I can't believe I forgot about this. If you want to hear my thoughts on all three books, the initial first chapters in all three books, I completely forgot to tell you this, Francisco. I did read all three, at least the first few chapters of all three books. So if you want to check out my initial thoughts, please see the little tab up above. It'll be the link to all three books. I'll also link them down below in the description. And honestly, I encourage you all to go and check them out. They are a fantastic read. The world building is phenomenal. The characters are so fun and engaging. And honestly, I cannot say enough good things about this trilogy. It is probably one of my favorite trilogies to read of 2024. So, Francisco, that is a huge kudos to you. You've made an amazing trilogy.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, listeners, I hope you enjoyed this final episode for the month of February, but do not despair. New episodes in March are slated, so be on the lookout. If you are subscribed to my newsletter, you'll be up to date with the new guests that will be featured on the channel. Some will be authors, some will be historians, and we will also have our next guest for the Historians Lounge Season 2. Until then, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, signing out.